Hello and welcome to today's module, Psychological Skills Training Introduction. We want to help you optimize your mental game to perform your best. The source for this information comes out of our Weinberg and Gold textbook, Foundations of Sport and Exercise Psychology, 7th edition. The learning objectives for this module are that we will be able to define psychological skills training, also known as PST, and discuss the psychological skills training program design. Identify myths about and factors affecting psychological skills training, identify and discuss psychological skills training methods, and the ultimate goal of psychological skills training. We should also be able to define coping and discuss tips for coping with stress in sport. What is psychological skills training? Well, essentially it refers to the systematic and consistent practice of mental or psychological skills for the purpose of enhancing performance, increasing enjoyment, or achieving greater sport and physical activity self-satisfaction. Now, it's ideally meant to improve our mental toughness. And with this practice, we take an educational approach. Most coaches will agree that sport is at least 50% mental. Some sports are as high as 80% or even higher. Now, it's important to recognize that athletic skill does not dictate whether or not psychological skills training is effective or not. Anybody can learn and practice psychological skills. Let's take a look at a couple other myths. So, some of the myths out there is that it's only for problem athletes. Well, yes, it's true. Problem athletes can definitely benefit from psychological skills training. However, any athlete can benefit from improving their psychological skills. And since we're taking an educational approach in this module, we'll be looking at things like goal setting, imagery, arousal regulation, concentration, and mental preparation. Now, from a clinical psychologist standpoint, it could be used to help with eating disorders, substance abuse, personality disorders, severe depression or anxiety, or even things such as psychopathology. So you can see that within this, it's important to understand your role as an educational sports psychologist or a clinical sports psychologist. So another common myth is that it's only for elite athletes. Well, this also is not true. It has been proven that young, developing, old athletes, athletes with disabilities, special populations, it all helps them to promote personal growth. So it's important that we allow and provide this type of training for everybody. Another common myth is that it provides a quick fix. This is not true, because practicing and developing mental skills takes time. And the last myth we want to dispel is that it's not useful. And again, there is plenty of research and anecdotal reports that indicate PST enhances performance. But it must be systematic and individualized and using a variety of psychological skills training techniques. So what are some guidelines for developing a psychological skills program? Well, there are some steps that we need to take in the design phase. There are 3 areas we need to consider: education, acquisition, and practice. During the education phase, this is when we teach concepts and theories and terminology that will be used to be able to allow the learner to understand the importance of the psychological skills and the effect on performance. During the acquisition phase, this is when we're going to begin to implement strategies and techniques for learning psychological skills. We will learn about these strategies during the education phase, but this is in the acquisition phase when we try to acquire the ability to actually implement these. And then when we implement them in the practice phase, this is when we systematically practice the skills to make them automatic when we're in situations that actually require them and when we're in performance situations. So we initially practice these skills during a training session, and we will end up then simulating those skills that need to be applied in competition in the same way we would practice our physical skills in a practice situation before then implementing them in a competitive situation. We have to do the same thing with our mental skills. What are some of the psychological skills methods that we are going to be talking about and implementing? Well, first and foremost is going to be goal setting. We'll also be discussing arousal regulation, self-talk, imagery, journaling, setting up routines, both pre-competition routines, in-competition routines, post-competition routines, and we'll also be discussing the importance of sleep. Now, it's important to understand that the ultimate goal of psychological skills training is that we become self-regulating. We self-regulate our behaviors, our cognitive behaviors, and our physical behaviors. And that includes problem identification, commitment, execution, managing the environment around us, and then generalizing what we learn in sport to other areas. So what does that really mean, and what does all this mean? Well, when we talk about problem identification, we need to change what is possible and take responsibility for figuring out a solution. We need to commit to dealing with the obstacles no matter how slow the process may be. And one of the most critical aspects of self-regulation is to be able to have self-determined behavior to execute, monitor, and evaluate progress towards coping with adversity. Now, it's important that we manage the social and physical environment around us and use social support, routines, and even sometimes finding a quiet place for relaxation training. Now, generalization refers to over time, learning something over time, and then taking what you learn from one setting and being able to use those skills in another setting. So, for instance, you learn how to goal set for sports. Now, how do you use that in the classroom? Maybe you've learned how to use self-talk to keep you concentrated and focused in on the present in sport. Well, how are you going to translate that into the classroom? That's known as generalization. It's when you take a skill from one environment and transfer it into another environment. When is the best time to begin a psychological skills training program? It's in the off season. Or if you don't have an off season, then in the preseason. And it doesn't take much time. It usually takes about 10 to 15 minutes at the start or end of a practice, and you can usually do this 2 to 3, maybe 4 times a week. And then that helps you master these elements and these skills in a practice situation. And from that practice situation, then you put it in a simulated competition situation. And then once you've mastered it in that simulated competition situation, you know and you'll feel comfortable using it in a competitive situation. Now, in your designing of a psychological skills program, it's important to understand what skills to include. And how do you determine that? Well, there are 4 categories that we can then dive into. First is foundational skills. We have performance skills, personal development skills, and team skills. The foundational skills, well, these are the basic skills necessary to achieve success. Things like self-confidence, self-awareness, working on your achievement motivation, and even your competitiveness. The performance skills are critical to executing the motor skills required. And this requires attentional focus, might require some imagery, incorporating some routines, and understanding energy management of arousal and anxiety. And this leads to improved perceived ability and competence, which will enable us to perform better. For personal development skills, this is really the maturity markers. This deals with our need to be related to others and the feeling of belonging and the development of relationship skills with others. As far as team skills go, well, this is the collective qualities of a team. And team skills include developing leadership, team cohesion, and collective efficacy. It's important that we use evidence-based guidelines to develop that self-determined behavior for all these categories. And that way you can assure you'll improve the psychological coping skills needed to perform your best. Before we get too far down the road in designing a psychological skills training program, it's important to understand the common problems with program design. And oftentimes due to lack of conviction, meaning that either the individuals that are going to begin the process of a psychological skills training program aren't convinced that it's going to work, or even the administrator of it, like a coach, isn't really convinced of it. They're basically been instructed to provide this service to their athletes or their students. And so there's a lack of conviction. One of the biggest reasons that psychological skills programs do not get off the ground is lack of resources. Now, If a coach does not know how to implement psychological skills training, then that in and of itself presents a problem, because there's the lack of knowledge is another big issue. But the lack of even resources, such as at a college level, they may not have enough money to hire a psychological skills training professional, such as an educational psychologist. And so without the resources, it's another problem with being able to implement a psychological skills training program. As mentioned just previously, that lack of knowledge, whether it be from the coach themselves, or sometimes an educational sports psychologist comes in to work with a team, and maybe they're working with a team or a sport for the very first time. And so they lack the understanding and the experience on how to implement it. So it's important that as professionals in the area of sport and exercise psychology, that we understand how to design psychological skills training programs, implement them, and then adjust as needed and individualize them for the participants. And then lastly, another major problem with implementing a psychological skills training program is that they may get started and they'll get off the ground, and you'll have set some goals, and you'll work on some imagery, and you'll work on self-talk to help with concentration and arousal regulation techniques. But at the end of the day, there's a lack of follow-up because you get so busy, especially if you're the coach and you're the one running it, as well as developing practice plans and developing game plans and everything else that goes along with coaching. Oftentimes you run out of time to follow up with your athletes. And that presents a problem because now we have no way to monitor or measure how well your program might be working. So by understanding these common problems, we need to be self-aware on how we can correct them and avoid falling into these pitfalls. So the ultimate goal of a psychological skills training program is to be self-regulating. And what that really refers to is being able to cope with adversity. Now, what is coping? What does coping mean? Coping is a dynamic process where you use cognitive and behavioral efforts to manage stress. Now, whatever strategy you use will depend on the personal and situational factors. There are essentially two categories of coping. There's problem-focused and emotional-focused. We typically use problem-focused when we see a problem that we feel that we can change or correct. This deals with the efforts we use to manage and solve the problem. Things that we incorporate when coping with problem-focused issues is we use pre-comp routines or goal setting, things like increasing our effort or finding a way to focus better by using appropriate self-talk. Now, with the emotional-focused coping mechanisms, this is more of a cognitive effort to actually change the meaning of the problem. We may see the problem as something that we can't extrinsically change. And so we have to internally reframe the way we look at it. The same way we have to reframe looking at stress as a positive, as an opportunity for personal growth. That's a coping mechanism that we would say would be an emotional-focused coping mechanism. Other coping mechanisms we use are meditation, relaxation, even wishful thinking. So how can we use all this information in developing a psychological skills training program to help us cope in sport? Well, simply developing psychological skills such as self-talk, goal setting, arousal regulation, and imagery will enable us to perform better. It'll enable us to control our thoughts and direct them to the present. It also helps us and reminds us that we need to be task mastery focused. By learning psychological skills, it'll give us a pre-comp mental prep plan in order to make sure that we are feeling our best even before the competition begins. Developing psychological skills really involves time management. And so by developing time management skills, we'll also feel more in control and feel that we have a higher perceived ability. Now, another element of coping in sport is that we train hard, but we also train smart. It's important that we don't overtrain, because by overtraining, we put too much stress on both our physical and our mental well-being. It's important that we allow for the rest to happen in order for growth to occur. And lastly, by developing a psychological skills training program, it'll help us cope in sport by developing pre in, and post-game routines that will allow us to perform our best. So to end here, I want to just share a few tips. These are some anecdotal tips for coping with stress. They're actually more simple than one might think. First one, smile. Simply smiling releases endorphins that help relax muscles and reduce tension. Find a way to have fun. Make it fun. Whether you're coaching somebody or if you're the one being coached, find a way to make it fun, because the more fun you have, the less stress will be there. It's also important that we actually practice being in stressful situations. By practicing stressful situations in a non-competitive setting will allow us to utilize the strategies in really high-level competitive situations. Another tip for coping with stress is just to slow down. Make sure we feel that we're in control. It's important that we understand that when we are overwhelmed, it's usually because we are not in control of all the tasks we need to take care of. And that could be whether it's work, life, social, or academic, or sport. We need to make sure that we can manage all those stresses in a way that allows us to perform our best. Another way to cope with stress is find a way to focus on the present. This oftentimes requires meditation or mindfulness. But it's really important that we don't think about the past or the future, because if we get too consumed with either one of those, we end up experiencing way too much anxiety and stress. And lastly, make a plan. Prepare, prioritize. Find a way that on a daily basis you make a list of things to do that will help you be successful in that day and be 1% better every day. Thank you so much for your time, energy, and effort in completing this module. Please go back and review the student learning objectives for this module and let me know if you have any questions. Have a great day. Go Beach!